It's time to talk about developing your spiritual path again. And today we're going to talk about one of the most important aspects of developing yourself spiritually, and that is mindfulness. A word you hear a lot about these days, but something that has at its core a very ancient practice of those who are trying to seek a spiritual path. Basically, being mindful means that you're conscious of the implications of everything that you are aware of. For example, if you are mindful when you use electricity, you might be mindful of it as something dangerous. You might be mindful of it as a limited resource and something that has an impact on the environment. And if you are mindful in that way, it's likely to lead you to change your behavior and switch off the lights in your house when you don't need them. So we're going to do an exercise in becoming more aware and more mindful so that perhaps we see ourselves as part of something larger and are aware of everything larger. So I'm going to describe the exercise to you, and you can go off in your own time and do it. And it really only takes 10 or 15 minutes, and it's a lot more fun than the exercise I gave you last month. So this time, you're still going to journal it in your journal afterwards, and you keep progress of yourself. But this time, we're going to go into the outdoors, and you just need to sit and stare at a patch of grass. You can imagine about half a meter across or something like that, and you can stare at that patch of grass. And don't, you're still going to blink. Don't make it difficult or painful for yourself. But the important part of this exercise is focus entirely on that patch of grass. Don't move your head or your eyes. So at first, there isn't much going on in your patch of grass. But as you begin to notice, you'll see that there are movements. Firstly, you'll notice some plants or little shoots or different types of grass, probably little weeds or other plants in between the grass that initially you didn't at first notice. But after a few minutes, you'll begin to notice that there are insects. There might be even ants walking around or some other insects. We have very strong filters in our brain, and they're designed to help us process information. So whenever we're looking at something, your brain is making decisions about whether that's what you're focusing on and whether that's relevant to the information that's coming in, that you're interpreting from your vision. Your brain partly makes those decisions on whether what you're looking at is actually moving or not, and also uses the information about whether it's familiar to you or something like that in order to filter it, to decide whether you need to see it or to filter it out. And amazingly, our brains can actually physically filter out things that it deems are not what are relevant to what you're looking at. But by sitting and staring at the patch of grass, your brain eventually starts getting the message, well, maybe there is something important here. And besides, there's nothing else to look at and there's nothing else going on. So gradually those filters begin to drop, and you will notice things that you would have sworn were not even there when you started looking. So after about 5 minutes, you will discover that there is a hive of activity and begin to notice, for example, what the ants are doing. So allow yourself to become at first completely absorbed in that. After the 5 minutes, and once you're really seeing whatever else is going on, without shifting your head or your eyes, begin to expand your awareness. So start tuning in into what can I hear around me. Begin to notice the sound of the traffic or of other people or of animals and pets around, and maybe even begin to feel what's going on around you. Begin to pay more attention to the weather or the temperature of the air or something like that, and literally allow your awareness to start expanding without taking your focus off your half a meter patch of grass. So instead of using your eyes as the information, you're now beginning to expand to include other senses, such as the auditory sense or the visual sense. And finally, you're sitting there after about 10 or 15 minutes completely aware of a vast array of sensory inputs going on around you, but really it's a mental awareness. It is a mindfulness because you haven't actually shifted your attention from the small patch of grass in front of you. So it's a simple exercise and it is rather fun. As kind of boring as it might sound, you'll actually be amazed, firstly at what you see, and then secondly, by sitting and allowing your physical attention to remain in front of you, how much you become aware of what's going on around you once you allow yourself to is quite astonishing. You can do it by envisioning a ripple going out from where you are, and like that, it gradually begins to encompass. I can hear the rest of the garden. I can hear the street around me. I can hear what's going on in that block of flats just over there, half a block away. And you might find that you become aware of sounds that you can't even imagine what they are or where they come from. Don't worry about what they are, but be focused on it is part of my environment. First time might be a little odd, but do that a couple of times and you'll quickly see how your awareness expands and how your sense of what your awareness filters out improves, which is an education in itself. The awareness that you have developed with this exercise is a physical awareness. It involves your physical senses. But the real lesson was in beginning to focus your attention on specific things. Developing your attention is a necessary step so that you can become mindful. Actually, many of the exercises and processes we do in this series on developing your spiritual life and in developing your spiritual life in general are about focusing your attention, are about concentrating. So the benefits will actually go beyond your spiritual life. Focused attention, better concentration. If you're a student, is going to help you at school. At work, it's going to help you with your work and actually ends up making you a lot more efficient in how you work in your life. Those are practical benefits, but it also helps us overcome the negative side of the senses and the negative side of the mind. The most negative side of the senses is the pursuit of unnecessary pleasures and becoming addicted to things which feed those pleasures. Mindfulness helps us with the discipline that we need to give things up that we don't need or to develop new practices that help you to master yourself. Effectively, addiction is the biggest enemy to self-mastery. Many of the things that we consider the greatest addictions of our society, be it tobacco, sugar, caffeine, alcohol, are not even seen as addictions by some people. They're seen as habits or parts of our lives or part of the modern world, and it's really just seen as pretty much ordinary modern living, which we know is not good for you. But anything that you need, which you can not comfortably do without for a few days, is an addiction because it is something that has mastered you. If you can't go without sugar, caffeine, alcohol, nicotine, or your favorite addiction, then you are not the master. It is the master, and you will never master yourself. Addictions aren't only to substances. There are other kinds of addictions. There are behaviors that might be considered addictive behaviors. There are beliefs and attitudes that we hold on to because they serve our purpose. It explains why I'm like this, or it provides an excuse why I'm like this. That is very similar to an addiction because it is mastering you. And there's television. You're even looking at it right now. And so television, like many of the things that are addictions, are not inherently bad in itself. But when it masters you, then you do have a problem. So press your own buttons. Don't be afraid to identify the issues of what can't I do without. What do I have a bad day about? Do I miss my soap opera? Do I have a bad day? Or what happens when I don't see the news that evening? Do I panic that I'm missing something? Those kind of things are good ways to identify something like an addiction to TV or whatever your favorite thing might be. Again, we're not saying TV is bad and it's not whether sugar or caffeine, etc. are bad. It's simply about who is the master in this situation. So that means you mustn't limit your definition of those things to things that you know are bad for you. What if you have an addiction to healthy foods? Maybe you never thought of that. Such a focus around health, being what's called a health nut in our society. You have to eat that kind of food, or you have to eat it that way, or you cannot eat that food or that way or something. Anything which causes you anxiety, worry, or sadness, if you have to do without it, there is an addiction that you can break. So it's clearly way easier said than done. I mean, it really sounds tough. But spirituality is real and spirituality is practical, and that's why it's tough. It's not all nice, airy-fairy things in the air. So obviously, you can't be expected to master breaking a habit very quickly and just, quickly do that, and then you can get on with your spiritual life. But there is an exercise that you can do that will help you use the awareness that you've learned to switch on, because you've learned that feeling of awareness. You've learned that feeling of expanded senses from doing the simple stare at the grass exercise. So using that expanded sense of awareness, you can develop a process to identify and disintegrate your habits with much less effort on your behalf than you probably think is required. So here's a way to use the mindfulness exercise in order to help break some habits. So to do this exercise, you're going to make use of that journal I asked you to get yourself a couple of months ago, or if you haven't yet managed to get around to that, just get yourself a nice clean piece of paper and a pen and find some time and space to sit and write yourself what is going to be a rather detailed letter. In writing this letter to yourself, you need to imagine that it's the higher aspects of yourself that is going to be getting this letter. You can think of it as like an idealized version of yourself, or think about it perhaps as the person you will be at the end of your spiritual journey. And that's to whom you are writing. The you that you are writing to has just one problem. It has absolutely no memory of the person you are right now. So in this letter, you're going to describe what you need to change about yourself, specifically which old habits, which old practices, which old beliefs, which addictions you need to get rid of in order to change. So the thing is that because of the amnesia of your ideal self further down the line, you're going to have to describe each habit or each issue in the most minute of details. You can't say something like, I need to work on my issue with food. You need to actually say in itemized detail just what is your issue with food. So statements like, I want to give up smoking might be true, but they don't give you the opportunity for much mindfulness. So the exercise will do that. The way to do it is in writing your letter, for each habit or addiction that you identify, include the information of when did it begin, which time in your life, or what were the circumstances at the time it began. When do you do it? When do you avoid doing it deliberately? Like, who's going to see you do it? Food is a common one. Smoking is a common one. What is the behavior that makes us avoid? And do you hide it from other people, or do you allow them to know about it? You might also give a few of the reasons why you think that you do it. And very importantly, describe exactly the pleasure or relief you feel when doing it. Take a moment to describe what it feels like to take that drag of that cigarette, and then how you feel after doing it, and then of course the consequences of doing it. So if you took the drag of the cigarette, describe the pleasurable feeling, the relief it gives you, the lack of stress that gives you, but don't be neglectful to describe the smell on your breath afterwards, the smell on your fingers afterwards, the guilt that you might feel for having smoked it, the coughing that you might be doing. So while doing an exercise like that, you also need to watch out for little tricks that the mind gets into. So we tend to give for example, stock explanations rather than your own explanation. So, firstly, there's pop psychology tells us, and the media and popular culture tells us, and it's really easy to fall into the kind of stock answer of why it's bad for you. So if you find yourself describing what's bad about your smoking or what's bad about you eating sugar in the standard kind of cultural terms, and even if you go to things like, I overeat because of I'm suppressing my emotions, it's a common psychological fact, but not for everyone. So make sure that you're talking about yourself, that you get the answers from yourself and from your own thoughts, not from the stock belief. Be specific. It's also important not to judge yourself in the process. We tend to make moral judgments of ourselves, and those moral judgments very often are also stock in trade. They come from a prevailing religious idea. They come from things that you were told or heard or trained in your childhood in some way. They come from the society and the social structures that you're in. And very often they just come from plain old guilt. All those social things, societal things, religious things instill guilt into you as a way of punishing you for the behavior. But usually, instead of stopping the behavior, it leaves us with guilt as the new problem. So we kind of create a greater problem for ourselves through those judgments. From that, you can see that habits are also behaviors. They're scripts that you have for your life. So, perhaps that you realize that you behave in a certain way under certain circumstances. Perhaps you sulk when someone criticizes you, or perhaps you feel guilt or self-pity when there's a negative emotional situation. It takes a lot of courage to admit those things to yourself. But remember, this is between you and your destination self, the one who has mastered the very issues that you're talking about. And that's going to help you want to be honest about it, because it is the only other person who can help you yourself, the only other person then who in the future is not judging you, because that judgment itself would be one of those bad moralistic habits. To succeed in growing yourself spiritually and potentially reaching that realized higher self, you have to be ready and willing to identify and admit your human foibles. We've all got them, and we probably can never get rid of all of them, but this process will help you become more mindful and aware so that you can start doing that. The most essential step in spiritual growth is to admit your humanity and to be okay with it, especially since you're going to be improving it anyway. Now here's how to use the awareness exercise we've already done to help you break that habit. So you start off, just like in the awareness exercise, finding a place to sit where you won't be disturbed, indoors or outdoors, wherever it may be, just somewhere where you can sit quietly. And sit with your eyes closed for a bit and become aware of your immediate environment, just like you did with the awareness exercise. The chair underneath you, the feel of the air around you, whatever may be the environment. Just tune in and become into that state of expanded awareness beyond yourself. There's things going on. Then, still with your eyes closed, imagine that you're looking at yourself from the outside. Make sure that you see the clothes that you're actually wearing, and you see the position that you're sitting in, and you'll notice little things that you don't realize you notice. You might notice that your shirt is slightly folded, or that your blouse has a spot on it, or whatever the case may be. Observe those things. Notice any characteristics that make the scene more real. And then come back to your awareness inside yourself, and now perform the habit. So you can imagine yourself smoking the cigarette or eating that food or whatever the case may be, while you're still sitting there in that state of awareness, and start allowing your expanded awareness into your body and become aware of what's going on in your body. If you're smoking a cigarette, imagine that you can feel and see the smoke going into your lungs, that you can feel the blood picking up all the nicotine and it's rushing through your body. But notice the tar being deposited and the chemicals that are making little cells in your body cringe and pull back. Or if you're eating the sugar and you imagine yourself eating the sugar, feel the sugar go into your system, see the sugar go into your system, see how your whole system responds to it. So you might visualize the pancreas responding and the insulin being made and everything rushing around. Imagine the sugar being stored as fat cells and see how adrenaline is released and see all those processes in your mind's eye. Or you might be imagining an emotional process. So if you imagine yourself going through the process as if from the outside, when you are imagining as an emotional process, an emotional behavior, look at it from the outside like you did in the first part of the process. See yourself engaging with the other person or whatever is triggering the response, and try maintaining your expanded state of awareness. See the situation from the outside. See what happens when you say something hurtful or when you receive something hurtful. See how it takes two people to make those emotional things happen. Watch from the outside, act as if you're a neutral observer. Then go inside your body and see, how does it feel? It's emotion. How does it feel in my stomach? How does it feel in my heart? How does the stress feel? Just use the principle of expanded awareness to start realizing the damaging effect of negative behaviors and addictions, whatever they may be. So I'm just using examples. You'll have your own bad habits or whatever their addictions are. But the bottom line is you start off by visualizing yourself from the outside doing the behavior, and then getting your awareness back into your body and allowing yourself to experience the consequences of that behavior, using the principle of expanded awareness that you've taught yourself to do that, by tuning into the senses and making sure that there's sound and smell and everything. And then at the end of the exercise, let go of the behavior and tune back into the environment itself, the sounds, the smells, the feeling of the chair, and relax and let go of it, and then write it down. Write down how that felt. The basic idea that we're pursuing is that the mindfulness itself is part of how to solve the problem. Being aware of the problem is half the step of solving the problem. It's not magic that's going to solve the problem for you, but it's half of it. It's funny how we so often refer to self-awareness or super self-awareness as a negative state, like self-consciousness. We're not too fond of the state of mindfulness because it makes us aware that we're not comfortable with ourselves. It makes us aware that we don't accept ourselves. Self-consciousness feels like embarrassment. The first step towards spiritual growth is to stop being so precious about yourself. In order for mindfulness to succeed, we need to accept those things about ourselves that cause that negative feeling, those habits, those beliefs. Accepting them doesn't have to mean that they're fine and that you think that they're fine. It just means acknowledging without judgment that they exist. You know, the main function of the ego is to protect ourselves and to protect our sense of ourselves that we mostly get from artificial things: society, rank, status, clothes, all the things that we're supposed to do and doing that, but that have no actual truth to them. And we need to break that stranglehold that the ego has in that way. There are some eternal truths. We know harming others, do not harm others, is an eternal truth. And no matter what your culture and what your time or space, those kind of things remain intact when we demolish the ego. Being good and not harmful to others is not an ego thing, it's an eternal truth. So mindfulness will help you see the difference and notice when the ego is what's running the show, and hopefully help you to work towards demolishing the ego. Our mindfulness exercise is not only good for getting rid of the things which prevent you from growing. Actually, it gives you an experience of the higher consciousness that we're trying to reach when we develop ourselves spiritually. And that little taste is what's going to take us much further down the road. Try it. And we will be back next week with the month ahead, including information about the political circumstances. So you won't want to miss that. Be here as usual on Friday. See you then.